You're welcome to this particular moment of linking up again. Today, we're going to focus on a kind of literature that is not often written, a kind of literature that we can say is specialized, a kind of literature that we might even argue is not very much common, in the world of world literature, so to speak, simply because of the way in which it is definitely highly specialized. It has to do with the peculiarity of its audience. And I'm not talking about just any kind of audience. I'm talking about a very, very sensitive audience that must, be approached with some nuance. And along this line, I'm talking about that kind of literature that talks to the younger ones, that talks to the children, that talks to, the people of the very, very impressionable generation. We're talking about children's literature today, and then we're also going to look at those things that make it very, very interesting and very much of a product that must be done in a very, very careful and very, very professional manner. Now, we have two ways of approaching literatures that have to do with the young. We can talk about the Juvenalia and then children's literature. I'll explain this. When we talk about the Juvenalia, we are talking about a kind of literature produced by authors when they are young. It is often a kind of literature produced when the author is in the formative stage. It's a kind of production that comes as a young person and then is written. Of course, the sensibilities and the experiences of such an author is going to reflect that age span, of their particular experience. And so we talk about the Juvenalia. When you talk about Juvenalia, definitely you are talking about the young, you are talking about a stage in life that is basically classified as immature. It's not got up to the point of maturity, vast experiences. Although these things are not always very much well defined because, just like life is, things happen to different people in several ways. The moment in which somebody is mature doesn't necessarily depend on an age range, but then in most cases, we know that, if somebody is between the ages of 1 to 6 or 1 to 7, there is no kind of experience, either beautiful or terrible, that can make that person absolutely mature in their conversation with the world. But then we can talk about a group of people that are young, and we can see certain peculiar trends about them. Number one, they are often learners. They are learners. They are people that ought to be guided. They are people that must be given some room to be carefully taken care of. And then we need to also know that it belongs to a particular group of people that are highly impressionable. So we're talking about, the Juvenalia there. So when you talk about the Juvenalia, it's often the kind of product, poetry, prose fiction, story, whatever it's defined as literature, that comes from that person who is of a very younger mode, within the very impressionable, writing and publishing at that point. At times too, we can classify Juvenalia as such work that belong to the young. But it's properly defined when we are writing as mature people or as adults for children. At that point, we are talking or we are writing from the angle of our own life experiences, trying to interpret or trying to project the experiences of children, or trying to articulate the experiences of children. And writing for children along this line would take a lot of imaginative skill. Now, when we write for children, you want to understand their mentality. You want to be able to faithfully trap the language in its realistic mode, the way children will speak, the way they will converse, the way they will imagine, the way they will do a number of things. You've got to put these things within your calculation of what you are putting there. Definitely when writing for children, we don't use highfalutin language. We don't use very hard language, such language that will require the dictionary. At least not often. We are coming to that point. We don't write such language that is twisted, not so much philosophical. In fact, we don't write philosophically for children, within a kind of philosophical balance. But then, all kinds of writing is ideological. Definitely what you are putting across is towards a goal, and it's within a kind of mental orientation. So you've got to be able to articulate what you are putting down for children. Now we've got to understand something very, very clearly, that when we use the nomenclature children, we are using a rather problematic term, because to talk about children is to assume that you have a mental picture of a group of people called children. And then you assume that in most cases, when people sweepingly talk about children, they are talking about imagined non-adults that seem to be within the same kind of mental experience, ideological location that is already well known. I dare tell you that can be a big mistake, a very huge one, because children are varied in terms of age group, in terms of their experiences, in terms of even their cultural environment, and definitely they're different in terms of their life exposures. So you have got to be able to also understand in writing for children, the public, the very childhood public you are writing for. You have got to be able to understand how to get their attention, and then you've got to be able to plan, to plot how you go about that well. Now, let's put it this way. Children are a vast range of people that we can actually classify as mentees, people we mentor, people still under some kinds of guidance from parents, from guardians, family members or non-family members. They are people that must be given direction. So when we talk about children like that, you are talking about a public generally that must be given, certain kinds of master tutelage or master orientation, or if you like, you can say a kind of people that must always be under our own ethical, moral, and intellectual surveillance. Children are necessarily under your surveillance. I'm not talking about a kind of surveillance that speaks about suspects. No, we are talking about people that must be guided. Now, having said that, children are not to be seen as an always knowable group. Now, in approaching children's literature, we've got to be able to know which kind of children. Now, for the purpose of this lecture, it's not necessarily a kind of hook, line, and sinker classification, but something of convenience for us so that we'll be able to navigate our own ways of addressing our own children audience. We can talk about 4 kinds of categories of children, and I'm going to use their age groups to make these categorizations. Number 1, we can talk about children from ages, let's say 6 months to about 5 or 6 years. Then we can talk about children from about 7 years to roughly 10 to 11 years. And then we can categorize children from about 12 years to 16 years. From 17 upwards, we can talk about fairly young adults. Young adults too can be approached as children because they have certain things they are still growing out of and gradually getting into the world of adults, the world of taking responsibility. the world of being accountable for a number of things they do, and definitely also the time in which they begin to deliberately and purposefully defining their life direction. So we can talk about a classification within the realms of 6 months to about 5 to 6 years, from 7 to about 10 to 11 years, from 12 to about 16 years. Then we can talk about a kind of narrow group between the ages of 17 to 19. Or let's put it at 17 to 18 plus, not actually up to 19. We can talk about that as a very senior category of the children we are talking about on this platform. Now let's come to the first category. The first category is the category I will call, that is 6 months to about 5 to roughly 6 years, will be the category that have these very clear characteristics. And I can call this the youngest of the childhood groups within this lecture. I will say this, that within that age group, the children are so much people that can be given such impression. They are so very much impressionistic to the extent that they are carried away by any piece of information you give them. They live with the information you give them. They are necessarily, let me put it in a more arresting manner, they are necessarily captives of what you give them. And this is a very delicate point of childhood training, childhood breeding, childhood development. And this is a very delicate place of parenting. I mean, if you're a parent, you will understand what I'm trying to say. The most susceptible moment of childhood is between the very young moment that the child is born to the point of roughly this time, 5 to 6, when they're actually going into kindergarten schools, going into schools over here that we call the primary school moment. They've gone through within 6 months to 5, you can say that they are within the kindergarten age group, but then they are gradually moving into what we can call the primary moment of going a little beyond or busting the balloons of kindergarten moments of life. Now, I'm fixing this age group within my first clarification of children's literature you are producing. In the first instance, you might be wondering, what literature do we give this kind of age group? What do they have to read? I mean, you can't be writing literature for, somebody of 6 months old to 5 months. I rather do something more serious. You are mistaken. In fact, this is perhaps the most important moment that we've got to make a solid foundation of their literary life. Now, how do we approach their own literature? Number one, we must know that their own literature is more of visual narratives, visual projections, visual texts. And we are producing a literature that is necessarily and dominantly visual in character. You wonder, how do we talk about visual literature? Well, I must tell you that even language in its genesis of being put within writtenness had to start with a kind of pictorial signification. Talk about the kind of letters you find in hieroglyphics, for example, which the Egyptians were doing on their caves in the ancient times. You know that hieroglyphics was basically pictorial language, and the meanings were clear to those that could decode those prints on those caves. Now, when we talk about pictures or, visuals as language, since they have narratives they are presenting, since they have their encoded meanings, and since they represent those meanings to an audience that can take them, we dare say that pictures can be accommodated as a form of valid linguistic writing. Although we can say this is valid linguistic crafting. Now, having said that, the literature of children within this age group will accommodate more of the visual and very much less emphasis on the linguistic. And this is why. You see, we are gradually bringing these children into the world of language use, into the world of identifying letters, into the world of reading, the primary moments of reading. And when you are teaching children to read, you are not giving them multi-syllables. You are not giving them words that go beyond 2 letters, 3 letters, 4 letters at the first instance. You don't want to go beyond monosyllables, bisyllables, and some very, very understandable trisyllable words that are monosyllabic, disyllabic, and also trisyllabic. You want to give them things they can easily accommodate. So the visuals actually do the work of linguistic communication within the mental scape, whereas the language that we write by those pictures, by those graphics, are just ways to initiate the meanings that are purposed within that text. Let me give you an illustration of this. Yeah, I have with me over here a particular children's text in literature I can call literature for this brand of children. Even the cover is dominantly visual because children of this age group learn more, in fact, get meaning through what they see. The eyes and what it takes is very much linked with that part of the brain in which meaning is very clearly communicated. So when they see things, they understand it very, very clearly. And then you only illustrate this meaning with the words that are written, so that those words become gradual ways of bringing them into recognizing meaning through language. A skilled teacher will use this kind of literature to teach children the fundamentals of identification of letters, identification of words, and following visuals. Now, this is the characterization. Have you ever seen characterization written like this? You have the characters put as pictures of people, and then you have Jess Koons, Balloon Dog, you have Kehinde Wiley, you have Frank Gehry, who acts as the Guggenheim Museum supervisor. You find Nikki Dosain-Fall as Nana, and so many others. This is what you will find in adult drama book in very intellectual format of characterization, the people that actually characterize what you are going to see there. Now let's turn to another page. Even when the publisher is doing his publication, this is not part of what the author does. The publisher must write the details about that book in very pictorial ways, colorful. Now, the word I need to emphasize here when writing for children is the word colorful. When we have brilliant colors like red, yellow, light green, blue, and all that, purple, pink, coming into a text that has to do with children, you are already arresting their imagination. That is the kind of thing that is done in adult literature when the narrative or what you are writing in prose or drama is filled with content that is arresting. What arrests children at this age is the color and the pictorial representation. Now we go on a little bit. Now the story starts. The story begins. Now, do you ever read a story like this as an adult? First 2 pages, and this is your book. Of course, you're going to throw it away that this person isn't serious. This person isn't writing literature. But this is children's literature for ages 6 months to 5 to 6 years. They go more with graphic illustrations. Now we are seeing something like a museum in the craft of a rhino. It's within a kind of rhinoceros, motif. But then even at that, look at the way in which Milo Freeman, the author of this children's literature, goes about this. Now you discover that all these 2 pages are talking about is about the event going on there. You can see some characters here, definitely children characters, still spotted in colors. The air is expanded. There's a sense of liberty here, sense of freedom, sense of breath, sense of, society here. Something interesting is going on here. And then he's saying today. Now this story is about a certain imaginary princess called Princess Arabella, and she's at the museum. There are a number of Arabella, texts around. The story goes like this. Today, Princess Arabella and her friends are off to the museum, and you can see them off to the museum here. The next page, not just any museum, even that is colored, maybe to give an emphasis. It's not even a matter of maybe, to give emphasis. And you can see that the font here is even more. It's bigger than the fonts of the words that come afterwards. All this have meanings. The fonts of the language you are using for children of this age must be very bold. It must be very much seeable. It must be something they can go with. And you can see that the words are very, very accessible. Not just any museum, but our very own Princess Arabella Museum. That will catch the fancy of the children. But I'm sure the person illustrating this will be telling them a number of things. Now, another thing about children's literature of this age is that they don't do the reading. The teacher, the illustrator, does the reading. In other words, that reader must take the children to the space where their interest is gained. And then you discover that the dialogue begins here. And what are we going to do here? Asks Prince Minon. You can see that the characterization is now coming in here. But then, this is a form of prose fiction. But in children's literature, we can't begin to talk about children's prose fiction of this age, of children's prose fiction, drama, or poetry. No, everything is nuanced. Everything is put within a context that primarily does something, which is the most important when you are dealing with this age group. You must get their attention. We'll continue with this the next moment we meet in class. Make sure you like this. Make sure you share it. Make sure you subscribe. Thank you very much.